How's it going, friends? Today, we're bringing to the channel one of those games that have made history. You'll see, if you stay until the end, why I say this, because it's really going to be one of the most spectacular endings you'll probably see in your life, because something like this rarely repeats itself. Through this game, of course, as always, we're going to learn a whole lot of things. That's why I like these classes so much, and they're so interactive, because I explain things to you. Something you can keep repeating. You can leave it for me in the comments, however you want. So I hope you're comfortable. Enjoy this class like never before, and let's get to it. We've taken the side of the black pieces today because the spectacular ending actually comes from these pieces, right? White starts with d4, and black responds with the move knight f6. From here, you already know that knight f6 is the most natural response of all. Against the queen's pawn, it's also very natural to play the double queen's pawn with d5, but knight f6, as I always say, is more flexible, because depending on how our opponent responds, we can either play d5 or do any other defense, whether it's like the one we saw a few days ago, the King's Indian defense. We could also play the Nimzo-Indian defense, Orthodox defense, even some Queen's Indian, or whatever we feel like. The game continued in the following way. c4, the most popular response against this knight f6, and here black decides on the move e6. Very well. When we see the move e6, we already rule out King's Indian, and we're now looking more towards perhaps a Nimzo-Indian, which would be the most logical, or an orthodox defense. Very well. The game continues in the following way. Normally, the white pieces here have two options. Either play knight c3, which is the main move of all, though it does allows the Nimzo-Indian defense, or a very modern move nowadays, which is knight f3, precisely avoiding the Nimzo-Indian defense, okay? Why? Because after this bishop check, they can defend, for example, with bishop d2, right? Well, very interesting. The game continues with knight c3, Nimzo-Indian defense with bishop b4, queen c2, avoiding doubled pawns when recapturing this knight, since the main idea of the Nimzo-Indian defense is to eliminate this knight with a bishop, because, as you can see, this knight is occupying very important central squares, and once eliminated, for example, our knight will have impressive strength. That's very good, huh? Trying to find the pieces that most control our position and eliminate them. For what? So that our pieces become even better. The game continues with d5, directly breaking the center, a completely normal move, and after this, a3. Here comes the first surprise, let's say, of the game. The most normal thing in the world after this a3 is to capture this knight. That's why we brought the bishop here. In this case, the player with the black pieces decides to retreat it again to e7. It seems like they're losing two tempos. In fact, they are, but it really stays in a very solid position. We'll see that it's very similar to an orthodox defense. However, well, the bishop would usually be on d6 in the orthodox defense, right? And not on e7. The thing is that retreating it to do 6 now wouldn't be a good idea because the move c5 would follow, you see, and this bishop would have to retreat. White is gaining immense space on the queen side in exchange for our loss of time. We've moved our bishop 1, 2, and 3 times, so this wouldn't be a good idea. That's why the black player directly moves his bishop back to e7. Pawn takes pawn, and pawn takes pawn, we reach one of the most typical structures in chess. This pawn structure is called the Carlsbad structure. How do we recognize this structure? Well, this type of structure occurs when the two D pawns are in contact, the two queen pawns, and then the black player is missing the king pawn and the white player the queen pawn. So we find on this king side, let's say a 4 against 4. Not really, or rather a 5 against 4, because this one is helping, a 5 against 4. And on the queen side here, we see a 4 against 3. That means that if all the pieces were exchanged, white would have a winning endgame on the king side, and black would have a winning endgame on the queen side. Obviously, there's still a long way to the endgame, but it's super interesting to always know what kind of pawn structure we're in, okay? Very well, the game continues with this bishop f4. Before defining the e-pawn, the bishop is developed, and now we're in a sort of London system, maybe, right? Let's say that in quotes because the London system isn't exactly like this, but the pieces are indeed placed in the same way. The knight is on c3 and the bishop is on f4. Who knows if at some point, if black decided to advance this pawn a lot, the knight could jump in along with the bishop and create some havoc on the queenside position, right? The game continues as follows. Pawn to c6, defending this d5 point well. And now white makes the decision to play the move h3. This move is always useful because there are often themes, if white plays with e3, of trapping this bishop and managing to eliminate it, so that black would be left with the bishop pair, which, as you know, almost always has an advantage against a bishop and a knight. Why? Because with the two bishops, one controls all the dark squares and the other all the light squares, and you have absolute control of the game. That's why white first plays, this h3 and black castles. The good thing about these kinds of classes is that you understand all the moves, why they're made, and then in your games, you're able to reason through your moves much better and therefore play better games. That's obvious. Once the bishop has its retreat ready, you play e3. All right, we're trying to develop this bishop, then this knight to f3, and look to castle kingside. All right, as I always say, let's try to understand what's happening in this game, right? Here we see a typical pawn structure where black has a solid chain pointing toward the king side, while white has a similar chain pointing toward the queen side. Do you remember what I always tell you about pawn chains? They dictate where the attack is going to go. We understand black's attack will go toward the king side because the pawn chain dictates it. Trying to go against the pawn chain usually isn't a good idea. If the chain points toward the king side, trying to attack on the queen side isn't usually very effective. So, following these basics, we know we'll try to destroy white's king side once they've castled. And white, as you can see, has their chain toward the queen side. Therefore, here they're going to launch the typical minority attack. Do you know what a minority attack is? Well, as I mentioned, you see these two pawns facing off against three, so they push forward to create weaknesses. The idea is that these pawns are well defended now, but if these two pawns try to advance to trade, for example, I'll explain quickly. Right, with this pawn wanting to break on b5, once traded, this pawn becomes isolated and weak. Maybe this rook could come into attack here, and easy to target weaknesses would be created. If they try to prevent it, they could always do it like this, and after the trades, for example, the c6 pawn would be weak, right? Well, this is just so you understand, it was like this. So you see the minority attack has a goal, and that goal is clearly to create weaknesses on this flank here. So now we have the plans ready, let's say, for each of the sides. The black side wants to attack toward the king side. The white side wants to launch a minority attack to create weaknesses on the queen side. The game continues in the following way. Rook 8, attacking the king directly. Bishop d3, really the pieces are just being developed here. Knight b7, knight f3. Castling is ready for the white pieces, and now the black pieces really need to maneuver this knight a bit to develop their last piece. What's more interesting for black? Developing the knight this way, or maybe moving it through here? Well, if you've perfectly understood what the game is about and where we need to attack, we know the correct move is knight f8. Look how important it is to understand strategy, huh? By the way, let's see what day it is today. Today, this video will be uploaded, if I'm not mistaken, on March 15th. Well, you should know that 2 days ago, yes, woman fight master Flavia Conchabello. And I uploaded a very comprehensive class on how to play against about the isolated pawn in the academy, yes. Last week he uploaded how to play with the isolated pawn in your favor, and 2 days ago he uploaded playing against the isolated pawn. You can watch it whenever you want, okay? If you're not in the academy, I'll leave it right down here in the description for all of those who want to improve much more. The idea here is that white takes advantage of black withdrawing their knight. See? Look at this. They withdraw their knight, and where was this knight pointing? Well, at the e5 square. Whenever a knight moves backward, we must ask ourselves what square was defended. So now white takes the opportunity to place a very good knight on the e5 square. Bishop d6, trying to put pressure on this point here as well. Castling. And now here, the black pieces decide to make a slightly strange move. What would be the most natural one? Knight g6, right? Why? Well, simply because now the knight has jumped toward the king side, they'd be threatening this bishop. White's bishop could move out, but what they did was knight e6, a slightly peculiar move. Careful, we're not going to say it's a bad move because you'll see the outcome of the game is completely thrilling, and it might be thanks to this knight too. But honestly, if we understand the plan of the position, it would have been a bit more correct to play the knight to g6. Well, the bishop is being attacked, which undoubtedly retreats to the h2 square. That's why that gap was created. And now the black pieces make the move g6. That's why they wanted to place this knight on e6 and not g6, to leave the g6 point free. This point has several objectives. First, being able to move the knight from e to the attack. Yes, this is the first objective. Second, being able to recycle the bishop through the dark squares if desired. Third, supporting a future bishop 5, thanks to this pawn. So it's true that this point also has its downsides, right? It leaves the dark squares weak, but it also has its advantages. Normally, we don't care that much about creating these weaknesses on dark squares. Why? Because this bishop can't exploit them because it's trapped there, let's say on h2, right? Very well, here white makes a move that probably isn't the best of the game, but they understand that now that the dark squares have been weakened, they want to exchange black's bishop for their own, right? Because that way they'll be left without a defender of the black pieces, and they play knight fd3 to face off these two bishops. The game continues with knight g7. White, faithful to their plan, exchanges the bishop, queen takes d6, and now the rook moves to the open file. The idea is probably clear. Trying to start the minority attack and placing the rook and the queen on the c file, pointing directly at this point, which can be weak in some cases. Why hasn't the other rook been brought over? Well, because since the attack has to come from these two minorities here, these two pawns, these two rooks are going to be very well placed, both toward the attack. This is the importance of understanding where each flank should attack. Following that move by the rook, black utilizes the pawn structure to catapult their bishop to f5, as we said, and now plays the knight to d2. This might seem like a good move, but it's really a move that has pros and cons, right? The idea is logical, to shift the attack toward the queen side. Mind you, they're running out of pieces on the king side, and this could take its toll. Where's the semi-open file for white? On the cuff file, they've already placed their artillery. Where's the open file for the black pieces? On the e file, so now they're preparing to double rooks on that very file. Before, there goes the minority attack, and black certainly continues with their plan. With the move, the a rook to e. All right, here maybe the best option would be to start attacking with these pawns. Probably the move b5 is already quite an interesting move. I really think it's the move I'd make in this case to try and open the lines directly. But white prepares it a bit more with the move rook b1 to play this b5 on the next turn. But watch out, because now the thrilling part of the game begins. The white player probably got a bit of a scare here when he saw his opponent's move. The idea is that when we see the king has 0 defenses, because he has none really, they're all, if we split the board into 2 flanks, all the pieces are on the queen side, it's time to attack the king. And if a piece has to be sacrificed along the way, it has to be. It can't be sacrificed. Because of course, considering, imagine we're going to attack with 5 pieces. If they defend with 0, right? Sometimes it's better to eliminate a pawn and attack with 1 less piece, but it'll really be 3 pieces against 0, right? And here, black's brutal move was this one right here. Bishop takes h3. What a beautiful move, isn't it? The bishop sacrifice must be accepted no matter what, because otherwise a pawn would be given away for absolutely nothing. The thing is, I think what he didn't calculate is the next move, that after sacrificing the bishop for a pawn, black sacrificed a rook for a pawn. Rook takes e3, the best move in the position. Obviously, capturing that rook doesn't seem at all like a good idea, because look, after pawn takes rook, the queen could surely enter through g3. giving a practically fatal check, because when the king moves, this rook could also enter, and along with the knights, white probably has no way to defend, maybe by giving up a piece, and that's why he didn't accept. The rook sacrifice, after rook takes e3, the white player, but instead played the correct bishop f1, trying to bring a piece to the defense. How impressive, right? As you can see, black's plan is simple and logical, isn't it? He wants to blow up the white king's position so that he's left totally exposed and he can checkmate him easily. The game continues. Instead of moving the rook, he continues with knight f5. Look at how this knight started out here. It went to d7, then to f8, then to e6, then to g7, and now it enters through 5-5. The idea is that if white captures the rook, it'll likely be followed by knight takes pawn, or first check, then knight takes pawn, and the queen and king's entries would be under attack. But there's really nothing better than capturing the rook, because if this rook isn't captured, and for example, they decide to continue with their threat, well, it could be followed directly by knight takes d4, also attacking the queen. The knight would enter through here, so either way, capturing the rook seems like the best move. However, black really has the artillery well placed now, and they continue in the following way. Queen g3, check. The bishop is placed between the king and the queen. Maybe it would have been slightly better to move the king, but oh well. It's very hard to defend perfectly. Only machines do that, right? Bishop g2, defended against the check. And here, I think the white player thought the logical thing is for him to capture this pawn with the knight now, and that wouldn't have been a good idea because then white would have simply played knight f1, a great move, attacking the queen. No matter how much they're attacking theirs, if exchanges happen, remember that white has a material advantage. In fact, they have a bishop and a rook up, so any piece exchanges will work in their favor. That's why here, very precisely, the black player didn't capture this pawn with the knight, but did it with the queen. And pay attention because now comes the most beautiful part of the game. The king has to move, right? Check. The king moves away, and now the knight also enters, giving check. The king has to move away, in this case to h2. There's no other option. Now there are no more checks or more interesting checks, but black uses the threat of the discovered check. With this queen f4, setting up a discovered attack with this knight to be able to deliver an interesting check. Probably all of us would move the king here, but the white player actually realizes that there's no interesting discovered check. It's true that he could win an exchange here, but white really has such a material advantage that this isn't enough, right? And they try to come to the defense with knight f3. What they don't know is that they're about to receive one of the most beautiful checkmates in the history of chess. Leave a like when you see the checkmate, because it's truly impressive. Pay attention. Which piece is missing to join the fray? The rook that's on the angle. And you know what? It's sacrificed right here. Rook e2. The idea is that it's being sacrificed because the rook can be captured by the knight. So then, chess teacher, why are they sacrificing the rook? Well, look, because now after knight takes rook, the knight captures the other knight, but with a check. And now, when the king has to move out of his check, and he has no choice but to go to the h1 square, the real power move is this knight to h5, trying to bring in both knights and leave that poor king with absolutely no options as he runs out of squares. In desperation, white tries to trade queens, but look how beautiful this is. One of the most stunning checkmates in history is coming. If you want, you can pause the video to try and figure it out. It's not easy, but I'm going to tell you right now. It all starts with this move. Knight to g3, check. The king has no choice but to move to h2. Knight to f1, double check. So you can't capture the knight because the queen is also giving check. So the king has to move. And now, look at this move. Queen to h2, check, sacrificing the queen. And when the queen is captured, black is left with only two knights on the entire board. But you can see it now. Knight to g3, checkmate with the two knights. This one gives check, and this one prevents any escape. Don't tell me that isn't absolutely impressive. Well, besides the academy, in the description, I'll also leave the app I use to study openings, mid-games, and endgames. You can choose to join the Academy, which, besides full app access, includes weekly classes from me and Fidemasters. Or if you just want to train with the app, you have that right down here in the description as well. I hope you all really loved this video. If you like this checkmate, give me a thumbs up, and I'll try to bring more games like this to the channel, because they're so enjoyable. And as always, friends, we'll see you tomorrow in the next video. Goodbye.